In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to create and, more importantly, migrate a custom field, which requires database level validation. If you are familiar with building a Django custom field, you can of course skip the first section of this tutorial. The main event is discussing and creating a custom migration for this new Django custom field that we are building. During our discussion, we will explore two key aspects of validation: server-side validation and database level validation. You can download the source code connected to this tutorial in the resources, and you can follow along that way. Else you can maybe apply this to an existing project or setup you have, or else you can just follow along and take a look at what we're going to explore here in this tutorial. If you download the source code, it will be a Docker setup. So we have a Docker container ready to go for us to actually utilize a database in this tutorial. So first step, I'll just go ahead and create the containers for our databases. Everything should be set up within this code. Let's take a look at the model. So we have a very simple model here, the product model. This is an example of a stock keeping unit. This is a unique code which will identify a product in my business. I want to build a custom field which is going to be tailored to store and validate these product identifiers, these stock keeping units, in this format. So the format here is 2 uppercase letters, 5 numbers, and then a mixture of uppercase letters and numbers, which there will be 2 of them. Now, the actual dashes must be included. So we're going to build a custom field which will ensure that each product identifier that we add into our database adheres to this specified pattern. So let's move back into the models and let's go ahead and build our new custom field. So the first question typically we want to ask ourselves when we're building a custom field is there an existing field which is similar to the field that we're going to build? And in this case, there is, and that's the character field. If you think about what we're trying to store, that information could be stored if we just created a character field. But of course, we want to create some unique validation here with the actual data that's being inserted. But other than that, it does follow all the rules of a character field. So if you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, what we're going to do here is we're going to inherit all of the behaviors and methods of the character field. And then we're just going to extend it to change it to what we need for our custom field. Okay, so a quick lesson on object-oriented programming, or at least give you some additional information so you can fully understand what's going on here. So in the background here, Django has the... So for those who are not familiar with object-oriented programming, let me just try and give you a brief overview of what's happening here. So behind the scenes, we have, or Django has the character field. It's a bit slaggy, isn't it? We have the character field class. So within this class, we have this special method, the initialization method. So this is a method in Python, and it's a special method used to initialize objects of a class. So it's also known as the constructor method. So inside of here, we have the initialization method. So what that's going to do in the character field class that we are inheriting from, it's going to start up and set up potentially anything that's required for the character field class to run correctly. So let's just think of that as maybe startup code to ensure that the character field class works correctly. So what we're doing here then is we are inheriting the character field and all the methods and behaviors of the character field. And the first thing we want to do when we instantiate or inherit the character field is we want to run the initialization method of the original character field class to ensure that all the setup is in place so that we can then go ahead and perform some customizations of this class. So just by inheriting the character field, that isn't necessarily going to initiate that initialization code. So what we're going to need to do here is to initialize it first. So this is why we have the code def init and then self. Let's go for args. So any arguments or keyword arguments. that might be passed in. So what we're doing here then is we are initiating the initialization method for this class, this original class that we're building here. Now what we need to do is use super to say that when we run this class, in actual fact, we want to run the initialization method or function from the character field class that we're inheriting. So this is why we run super. So we say super and then dot, and then we specify the method function that we want to run in the character field class that we're inheriting. And that's obviously the initialization function method. So we'll go ahead and again, utilize args and quarks. Now these args and quarks, keyword arguments and arguments. So what we're doing here, remember this is a function and we're passing in potentially when the original initialization method is initialized on the character field class, it might be that we have to pass in or some data is passed into that method in order to perform some setup for that particular class. So what we're doing here when we create our initialization function in this class is potentially we're passing over any arguments or keyword arguments over to that character field class through this super here. This will allow us to perform any customizations we need when the character field class is initiated. Right, so we've inherited everything from character field. We've initialized the initialization method of that class, and now we're ready to perform some customizations. So within the character field class, you'll find a method called validate. So this is utilized to actually validate whatever we're trying to insert into this particular field. So we know a character field will accept numerous different characters, but there are obviously things we can't do with a character field. And obviously the validation function within that class is going to prevent us from performing those things that the character field should not be doing. So the validation function here is going to allow us to specify how we want our data or how our data should be formatted before it's inserted into the database. So let's go ahead and add our argument. So self value. So I'm just copying at this point. If you have a look at the character field class, the Django character field class, you'll find that the validate method, we need to pass in self, value, and model. So at this point, I'm just copying what I can see in the original character field validate method. Right, so what I need to do now is use super again because I want to get the function. I want to utilize the method, the validate method from the original character field class. So I use super for that, and then I specify the method, which is validate, and then I can pass in potentially anything into value and model instance. Okay. So in some ways, what I've done here is I've initiated the original method from the character field class that we are inheriting from. And now what I can do is to create an override. Because what I'm saying here is that, okay, what we're trying to build, this field, it closely matches the character field. So we want to use all the validation which the character field is originally set up for. And then we want to add our own validation. So in some ways, we're just copying and pasting the character field, and we're just adding now our own custom validation. How we're going to validate, how we're going to check to make sure the structure of what's being inserted matches the structure of the SKU code that we want to insert into our field is we're going to use regular expressions. So RE, which we're going to need to import RE, is a module in Python standard library that's going to provide support for working with regular expressions. So regular expressions, often abbreviated as regex or regexp, are patterns used to match character combinations in strings. If you are moving into development, it's well worth reading through and familiarizing yourself with regular expressions because no doubt at some point you'll probably bump into them. And having knowledge of them can be very powerful in certain situations where potentially you're pattern matching or maybe you're pattern extracting or potentially you're performing some sort of string manipulation. So it can be very powerful for those particular instances. So what we need to do now is we need to create an expression, if you like, which will validate the string that we insert or we are going to be trying to insert into this field. So we want to make it a match. So we're going to say if not, so RE, and then we're going to use match. So match is essentially what it suggests. We're going to need to match whatever we insert into this field to whatever we specify here in match. So here we're going to set out the format of which the user must utilize if they were to try and insert anything into this field. Okay, so we're going to prefix this with R. Okay, so the prefix before a string literal denotes a raw string literal. Okay, so we're going to use doubles at this point. So the reason we're using R is because we're going to be utilizing a backslash. So R, like I said, indicates that the string literal here is a raw string. So the backslash is going to be treated as literal characters and not as an escape character. So let's go ahead and see if we can now build this. So first of all, the format. Right, so the first thing we need to do is to match the first two characters, which must be a character between A and Z, and they must be capitalized. So that's the first part that should match. So here we need to specify, so we need to assert the start of a string with the hat, and then we can go ahead and specify the format of the first two characters. So they must be A to Z. So I've added it in capitals to denote the fact that they must be capitalized. And then we need to define how many. So I'm just going to specify here in the curly braces 2. Right, so the next part of the format is a dash. And then we have 5 numbers. So we need to specify 5 numbers between 0 and 9, of course. So 5 numbers, 0 to 9. So for that, I'm going to specify, in this case, \d, lowercase d, and then I can specify 5. So we use the dash to specify we want to match, there should be a dash there, and then the d here, this d refers to the fact that we must be matching exactly 5 digits, d digits. Then of course we have another dash that should be matched, and then we have a situation at the end. So here we're specifying the fact that we can have any uppercase letters, A to Z, or else potentially any numbers, 0 to 9. So it could be a mixture of letters and numbers. So for that, we just need to specify letters and numbers. So A to Z, and then 0 to A to Z, 0 to 9, and then finally we can assert the end of a string using the $. So what do we want to match this against? We'll just need a comma here and then define the value. So this represents the actual value that we're trying to insert into this field. So we're trying to match this with the actual value that we're trying to insert. Now, of course, if it doesn't match, we want to raise a validation error, sorry. So let's go ahead and raise a validation error. So we just need to import that in. So from Django.core.exceptions, let's bring in the validation. Is that right? Yeah. Oh, I need to import, sorry. Validation error. There we go. Okay, so raise validation error. So now that we have our custom field, we just need to include it in our model. So let's add that. So SKU, stock keeping unit. And let's go ahead and add our custom product number field. Should we call it SKU field? Hopefully that makes sense. I used number to begin with to give you a general idea, a better idea of what we're doing. So SKU, stock keeping unit, some sort of unique number for our product. So custom product field, and then we just need to pass in well, let's use max length. Remember, we are using a character field, so we will need to specify the max length, which is going to be 12 in this case, or 11 or 12. And then let's go ahead and set the unique to true. Let's now talk migrations. So first of all, I'm going to migrate this and we're going to have a look at the default behavior. And then we'll go ahead and create our custom migration. So the reason we're going to have a look at the migration, the default migration, is because potentially you might not want to create a custom migration for this, because in actual fact, this will get validated by the app. So let's go ahead and migrate. So I'll quickly build a new super user. We're then going ahead and run the server. We want to get into the admin section. So in the admin here, I have set up product. And at the bottom here, I have registered the product in the admin. So we're going to go ahead and have a look at this. Right, so in the admin, go ahead and log in, go to products. Let's see if we can add something now. So name, SKU, that's our custom field, and slug. So when I press save, you can see that in actual fact, we can save. So if we take a look at the models again, you might have already guessed what the issue is here. For some reason, I've added the method inside the method here. So I'm just going to bring that back out. Let's try that again. So let's now try and insert again. And you can see this time we do have a validation error. But we're told in actual fact that we are missing the actual message. So let's go ahead and add a message here. So let's just define the format. So the format should be 2 uppercase, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 numbers, and then letters or numbers. So that's the format that we're expecting. So let's try that one more time. Hopefully now, there we go. So we're told that we cannot now insert. Our custom field validation is now working. And then we're provided some information regarding the format that's expected. So let's go ahead and follow this format, 5, F1. So let's press save. And you can see that we're still told that there is an error. So can you spot the error? So obviously what's happening here is that the validation isn't being matched. So this definitely does point towards the fact that we're not potentially matching correctly. Now, if we take a look at the format here, I've specified in each section the characters or numbers that can be used, as well as the amount. And what you'll notice at the end here, I didn't actually specify. I need to actually specify how many characters or numbers, and that's 2. So let's go back again and now save. We're good to go. For your particular setup, you may be happy with that. As long as you're using your application to insert the data and it's going through Django, potentially that validation is always going to be checked. But here we have 2 types of validation. We have the server-side or app validation, and we have database validation. And they are 2 completely different approaches used in development to ensure data integrity and security. But they operate at different levels of the application stack, if you like, and they do serve different purposes. So what we've seen so far is that we have created our custom field, and anytime we insert any data into the database, it's going to work through that custom field validation. It's going to get validated, and then the database is then going to store that data. Obviously, we would generate maybe some validation on the server side or within our app to ensure that our data meets our business rules and requirements before it's then accepted by the application and inserted into the database. But if we were to actually insert the data directly in the database, let's take a quick look here. So this is adminer, which you can access on 127.0.0.1.80.80. Let's have a look at the, let's see if we can log in. Server is Django DB, Postgres, database Postgres. Let's have a look at our database. So this is the database that we've migrated, the inventory product here. If we were to add a new item here, so name, slug, SKU, notice that it will get saved in our database without being validated. So, database validation involves enforcing data integrity rules at the database level using constraints, triggers, or maybe stored procedures. So, in this scenario, when we're utilizing database validation, the actual validation occurs within the database system itself. Now, there's a big debate here over server side versus database validation. Should you be using database validation or should you solely rely on application server side validation? So, for example, those who advocate server side validation would argue that validation logic belongs within the application or business logic layers. They would generally believe that the server should be responsible for enforcing business rules and ensuring data integrity before it persisted in the database. So there's elements here of separation of concerns. So each layer of the application stack, presentation, business logic, data access has its distinct responsibilities. The other side of the coin here is that database validation, or those who advocate database validation, argue that the database is the ultimate authority for data integrity. So they may advocate for forcing constraints and validation rules directly within the database to ensure that invalid data cannot be stored, regardless of how it's submitted to the server. So really, it's entirely up to you how you want to set up your validation. Of course, we're going to show an example now of creating validation on the database side, which will require us to actually build a custom migration. If we take a look at the original migration for this, you can see that the SKU was migrated, the max length and unique was applied, and you can see that we are referring to our custom product SKU field. Right, so we're going to need to make a custom migration. So for this, we'll go ahead and use manage.py, then go ahead and make migrations. Migration. We'll create an empty migration so that we can populate it. The app name, which is inventory. And then we'll add a name, or we'll supply a name for this migration. So that's going to be add product SKU constraint. Okay, so that's our empty migration we've just created. Okay, so let's separate this slightly. Let's first of all add the SQL. Let's generate the SQL needed. So this is add constraint equals. So let's go ahead and build the required change. So we want to, in this case, alter table because it already exists. Now, it might be different if you were to run this with the initial migration, but alter table inventory product, that's the name of the table. So we want to add a new constraint. And that's going to be called, oh, sorry, on the inventory. No. The name. So add constraint. Let's call this valid product SKU. Okay, so that's what we want to call it. And then we're going to create a check constraint. So the database is going to, with the check constraints, obviously check the data that's been inserted into the field utilizing these instructions. So this is the SKU field. We can then use title and then single. And now what we need to do is to specify what we have already done with the custom field. So we need the hat to denote the fact we're going to start our check, A to Z, specified to. So that's the first portion. So we're just literally following. We can just copy and paste this. Now you've got the general idea. So I'm going to copy that, paste that in. Just make sure that's correct. Finish that up. So that's our check constraint. Notice again, we're using regular expressions, so it's exactly the same. And then we can use the semicolon, and there we go. Right, so in situations where potentially you have a number of different steps, you might need to, might want to tailor this in a different way. Then you might create a new function before you then pass it into the migration section here. You don't need to do that. And I won't do that in this case, but just to give you a heads up there on the fact that you could perform potentially other operations, but we can directly include that now within our migration. So we just need to specify in the operations that we want to run the SQL that we've defined. So migrations dot and then run SQL. And then we just need to specify what we want to run, and that's the SQL add constraints. Right, so let's go ahead now and actually migrate. So let's make migrations. Actually, we've done that, so we just need to migrate. So we're told here that we can't do that, okay? Because what's happened is it has tried to apply that constraint, and of course, we've already added some data into the database. If we take a look, the original, we created some data here, and that doesn't follow the pattern. So in actual fact, we cannot apply this until the data that exists in the database is formatted correctly. So there will be cases where you are performing these type of operations, and you will need to perform operations on the data. Now, a bit later on in this course, we will focus on that. But for now, we're going to skip that step. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that row, that record. This one should be absolutely fine. So let's go back. So let's run the migration again, and this time it is successful. So what I can do is, because everything is stored in the database, everything related to this database, all of the different check constraints or unique constraints, this is stored within the database. So we can actually take a look at this. If you take a look at the notes file, there is a SQL query here, which we can utilize. And this will show us the data that's being stored in the database related to our check constraint we've just created. So this is the name, and this is the check constraint. So we can actually see where this is stored in the database and what's going to be utilized. And this will allow us to maybe just solve any issues or problems that we might have if the check constraint isn't working correctly. If you take a closer look at the actual query, you can see there is a table called PG constraint, and we're basically looking inside there for and extracting the constraint name, the definition, and where the con name equals valid SQ product. So where the actual constraint, so con name, constraint name equals valid product SKU. So that's what we're doing there. You can see the constraint. So now this is applied at the database level. So if we were to go back into our database, let's go back into our database and then the inventory product table now, and then go ahead and try to add some new data. Of course, now the check or validation is being done at the database level. So we won't be able to perform this anymore. We will need to follow the rules. So 2 letters, 5 numbers, and a combination of 2 letters and numbers. So we can probably save that now, and there we go. And there we have creating a custom field, migrating using database level validation.